The stylus moves before the scribe's eyes have fully adjusted to the lamplight. He's in the archive room of the Ekur, the great temple of Nippur, and the oil flame beside him is small and steady, casting just enough amber glow across the surface of the wet clay tablet he is pressing into shape. Outside, the city is quiet. The Euphrates is low this time of year, and the air that comes through the narrow slot in the mud brick wall smells of river silt and dried reed. He presses the wedge-shaped tip of the reed stylus into the clay, and the marks appear. Small, precise, grouped into signs that his hands know better than his mind knows them. He has been making these marks since he was 6 years old. He is now 53, and his hands have never once cut the wrong angle. The text he is copying tonight is not new. It is ancient even to him, a narrative so old that no one in the Ekur can say with certainty how many generations of scribes have transmitted it before his own hands touched it. The words speak of a time before the flood. They speak of the great ones who came down, the great ones who built cities, the great ones who, at a certain moment in the deep past, a moment of devastation so total that the earth itself changed, left. That departure is what the scribe is writing about tonight, and it is what this documentary is about, the Anunnaki. The term appears in Sumerian clay going back to at least 3000 BCE, and the texts that carry it stretch across a span of more than 2000 years of continuous cuneiform tradition. They are not a minor footnote. They are woven into the Sumerian king list, into the Atrahasis epic, into the Enuma Elish, into the great flood narratives, into the lament texts of cities destroyed, into the hymns of kings seeking divine legitimacy. They are in the cosmology preserved on thousands of tablets recovered from the ruins of Nippur, Uruk, Lagash, Eridu and Nineveh, the senior divine beings who shaped the conditions of life on Earth and who ultimately withdrew from it. The word Anunnaki is generally rendered in Sumerian scholarship as something close to those of royal blood or the princely offspring, though the literal components of the name, An, the sky god, and the suffix relating to offspring or seed, have been translated and debated across generations. What is less debated is the role these figures play in the texts. They are the ones who decreed fates, who assigned labour, who established the institutions of civilization, and who, at a specific and catastrophic juncture that the ancient scribes returned to again and again, departed from the earth they had organised. That catastrophe is real. It is described. It is not vague mythological colouring. The ancient Sumerian and Akkadian texts give it specific characteristics: a flood of unparalleled scale, fire from the sky, darkness that covered the land for days, the collapse of cities, the abandonment of temples. The texts say the great ones left. They say the earth was changed. They say the connection between the divine and the human, a connection that had been operational and direct during what the Sumerians called the Age of the First Kings, was severed at that moment and never fully restored. This documentary follows those texts. It stays with them. It follows the clay, follows the reed stylus, follows the words that Sumerian and Akkadian scribes pressed into wet earth for more than 2 millennia, because whatever they were recording seemed to them too important to allow to disappear. The evidence here is textual. That is the spine of everything that follows. The ancient texts are not background. They are not atmosphere. They are the primary source, the protagonist, the substance of what you are listening to. Welcome to this documentary. If you are lying down, you are in exactly the right place. This recording runs for approximately 2 hours. It is designed for slow listening, for the kind of attention that doesn't grip, that floats, that follows a voice in the dark the way you follow a river without needing to see where it ends. You don't need to take notes. You don't need to do anything except listen. The topic tonight concerns a specific promise buried in some of the oldest written records human civilization has produced. That promise is this: something happened. Something so severe, so structurally final, that it changed the relationship between the earth and the beings the ancient Sumerians called the Anunnaki. The texts say those beings came. The texts say those beings worked here, built here, established the conditions of human civilization here, and then, at the moment of the catastrophe, they went. And the texts that record that departure do so not with relief, not with neutrality, but with a grief that is still readable in the clay after 4,000 years. That grief is where the documentary begins. To understand what was lost and what kind of catastrophe could have caused the Anunnaki to leave permanently, you have to go back to the time before. the time when, according to the Sumerian texts, the connection between the divine and the human was direct and operational, not symbolic, not theological in the abstract sense, operational. The texts describe the Anunnaki as physically present. They describe them interacting with human beings and with the Earth's geography in ways that are concrete, administrative, almost bureaucratic in their specificity. The Sumerian king list, one of the most extraordinary documents to survive from ancient Mesopotamia, opens with a statement that has puzzled and fascinated every serious reader who has encountered it. The list begins before the flood. It gives the names of cities, it gives the names of kings, and it gives their reigns in numbers so vast they seem to belong to a different kind of time than the one we inhabit. After kingship descended from heaven, the text says, the kingship was in Eridu. The first king listed is Alolim of Eridu, and his reign is given as 28,800 years. The next king of Eridu reigns for 36,000 years. 5 cities are listed before the flood. 8 kings rule in those 5 cities. Their combined reigns total 241,200 years. These numbers are not accidents of scribal error. They appear consistently across multiple recensions of the king list found in different cities. The Sumerian scribes who copied and recopied this document across centuries were not confused about what they were writing. They were transmitting a tradition that held, as a foundational assertion, that the period before the flood was a different kind of time, longer, governed by different rules, inhabited by different kinds of beings operating alongside humanity. The Anunnaki appear in those pre-flood narratives as the active governors of that age. They are the ones who decreed the rains. They are the ones whose assembly, called the Ubshukina in the texts, the great hall of fates where divine decisions were made, determined what would happen on Earth. They assigned the divine offices of civilization, kingship, priesthood, the keeping of the temples, the distribution of the land. The texts describe this period not as a golden age in the sentimental sense, but as a structured, administered reality in which the boundary between the divine and the human was permeable and functional. Eridu is the oldest city in the Sumerian tradition, and it is the city where that administered reality was centered first. It sits at the edge of the ancient marshlands of southern Mesopotamia, where the Euphrates split into channels on its way to the Persian Gulf. In the period the texts describe, the Gulf extended further inland than it does today, and Eridu stood near the water's edge, a place where fresh water met salt water, which in Sumerian cosmology was itself a sacred threshold. The god Enki, one of the senior Anunnaki, was associated specifically with Eridu and with the Abzu, the underground freshwater ocean that the Sumerians understood to lie beneath the surface of the earth. Enki's role in the catastrophe narratives is central. He appears in the Atrahasis epic, in the flood narrative embedded in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and in several other Sumerian compositions as the one Anunnaki who did not simply comply with the decision to send the flood. He is the one who finds a way to warn a human being, in the Atrahasis text, a man called Atrahasis, meaning exceedingly wise, in the Gilgamesh tradition, a man called Utnapishtim. The warning is oblique, delivered through a reed wall because Enki has sworn not to reveal the divine decision directly to a human. He speaks to the wall, and the human on the other side listens. It is one of the most unusual scenes in ancient literature, a god obeying the letter of an oath while violating its spirit, because he cannot bear the total destruction of the creatures he helped to shape. That tension between the decision of the divine assembly to destroy and Enki's resistance to that decision is present throughout the catastrophe texts. It tells you something important about how the ancient Sumerian scribes understood the nature of the event. The flood was not inevitable. It was decided. It was voted upon in the assembly of the Anunnaki, and it was executed against the wishes of at least one of the senior Anunnaki, which means it was a contested political act, not simply a natural disaster dressed in mythological clothing, but a crisis within the divine order itself. The trigger for that decision, according to the Atrahasis epic, was the noise. It is a strange and specific cause, and its strangeness is worth sitting with for a moment. The text says that the Anunnaki could not sleep. The human population had grown too large. The noise they made, the noise of their lives, their cities, their labour, had become intolerable to the great divine beings who had originally created humanity to carry out that labour. The Akkadian word used is rigmu, which carries meanings of noise, clamour, outcry, and also, in some contexts, complaint or protest. Whether the ancient scribes meant literal noise or something closer to the weight of human activity pressing against the divine realm is a question the texts themselves leave open. What the texts do not leave open is the sequence of what followed. The Anunnaki tried smaller measures first, a plague, then a drought, then a famine. Each time the human population recovered, each time the noise returned. Finally, after a debate in the Divine Assembly, a debate the Atrahasis text records with a political specificity that is remarkable, the decision was made to send the flood, a flood that would be final, a flood that would settle the problem permanently. And it was that flood, and what came with it, that changed everything. Not just for humanity, for the Anunnaki themselves. That is the direction this documentary takes from here. The catastrophe that the texts record was not simply a punishment delivered from above and then done with. It was an event with consequences that ran in both directions. Consequences for the human world, which had to rebuild from almost nothing, and consequences for the Anunnaki, who, according to the cumulative testimony of the ancient texts, never returned to the same relationship with the earth that they had held before. The period of direct operational presence ended. The cities were rebuilt, but the divine administrators did not come back to administer them in the same way. The Sumerian scribes who recorded the post-flood world describe a different kind of divine presence, more distant, more mediated through ritual and priesthood and sacrifice, less immediate, less physical. Something had broken. The catastrophe had broken it. And the question this documentary pursues through 2 hours of ancient testimony is this: what exactly was that catastrophe? What does the textual record say about its nature and its components? And why did it result in the Anunnaki's permanent withdrawal from the earth they had, according to every text in the tradition, spent an enormous portion of their existence building? The scribe in the Akur finishes a line, pauses, and tilts the tablet slightly toward the flame to check the depth of the marks. They're good. They will survive. He smooths the edge of the next column with his thumb and positions the stylus again. Outside, the Euphrates moves in the dark, carrying silt toward a delta that has been reshaping itself for 10,000 years. The city is asleep. The scribe is not. He has more to copy before the clay dries. The Atrahasis epic is not a short text. It survives across multiple tablet sets, in multiple recensions, copied and recopied across more than 1,000 years of Mesopotamian scribal tradition. The oldest substantial versions date to the Old Babylonian period, roughly the early 2nd millennium BCE, but the narrative itself is understood by scholars of the cuneiform tradition to be considerably older, rooted in Sumerian compositions that predate the Akkadian synthesis by several centuries at minimum. It is, in its full form, a 3-tablet narrative of the entire span of human history from the moment of creation to the moment of the flood and its immediate aftermath. And what makes it unusual, compared to other ancient flood accounts, is that it doesn't begin with the flood. It begins with why the flood happened. It begins with the labour. The opening of the Atrahasis epic describes a time before human beings existed, when the work of maintaining the earth, digging the canals, clearing the riverbeds, carrying the loads, building the structures, was assigned to a lower tier of divine beings called the Igigi. The Igigi worked under the authority of the senior Anunnaki for what the text describes as 40 years of divine time, and then they stopped. They burned their tools. They surrounded the house of Enlil, the chief executive of the Divine Assembly, in the middle of the night and refused to continue. The text is explicit about this. It is a labour strike, a divine rebellion against impossible conditions. Enlil's response is to summon the Great Assembly. The senior Anunnaki gather: Anu, the sky god; Enki, the god of wisdom and water; Enlil himself. They deliberate. And it is in that deliberation that the decision is made to create humanity, a being that will carry the work the Igigi refuse to carry. The text uses a specific word for this creation, Lalu, sometimes rendered as primitive worker, and describes the new being as fashioned from clay mixed with the blood and flesh of a slain divine being, so that the intelligence and the spirit of the divine would be present in the creature but subordinate to the purpose for which it was made. This origin story matters for understanding the catastrophe. The human being in the Atrahasis cosmology was not created for companionship or out of love. It was created to solve a management problem in the divine administrative structure. That functional origin carries within it the seed of the catastrophe that follows. If the human being becomes more trouble than it solves, if it grows too numerous, too loud, too demanding, then the logic of its creation suggests that the same assembly that decided to make it can decide to unmake it. And that is precisely what happens. The growth of humanity in the Atrahasis epic is described in terms that are almost geological in their patience. The text does not move through human generations quickly. It pauses. It lets the reader feel the accumulation. 1,200 years pass. The land is filled. The people are many. And then the line appears that sets the entire catastrophe in motion. The gods cannot sleep. The noise, the rigmu, is too great. Enlil calls the assembly and the interventions begin. The first intervention is disease, a plague so severe that the human population drops sharply. A man named Atrahasis, the wise, the exceedingly perceptive, consults with his god, who is Enki, and Enki tells him what to do. The text is precise about the mechanism. Atrahasis instructs the people to stop making offerings to all the other gods and to direct all their prayers and sacrifices to a single deity, Namtar, the god of plague and fate. Namtar, overwhelmed by the attention and the flattery of so many concentrated offerings, becomes embarrassed and lifts the plague. The human population recovers, the noise returns, another 1,200 years pass. The assembly meets again. This time Enlil chooses drought. The rain stops, the fields dry, the rivers lower, the fish disappear from the shallows. Again Atrahasis consults Enki, and again Enki finds a way around the decision of the assembly without technically violating it. He instructs Atrahasis to divert all offerings to Adad, the god of rain and storm, and Adad too is moved by the concentrated devotion and sends rain. The famine lifts, the population recovers, the noise returns. A third intervention follows. Another famine, this time accompanied by restrictions on the fish of the sea and the grain of the field simultaneously. And again, Enki provides the workaround. The human population survives. It grows. The noise, louder now than before, rises again to disturb the sleep of Enlil. At this point, the text records Enlil's frustration in terms that are almost domestic in their specificity. He is angry not just at the humans, but at Enki. He accuses Enki of working against the assembly's decisions. He demands that Enki stop helping. And Enki, in a passage that gives you a sense of how the ancient scribes understood the politics of the divine world, pushes back. He argues that the flood, the final measure Enlil is now proposing, is excessive. He argues that there are other ways. But Enlil has the assembly behind him, and the decision is made. The flood will come. It will be absolute. Nothing will survive. Enki's response to that decision is the pivot of the entire narrative. He cannot warn humanity directly. He has sworn an oath with the rest of the assembly, but he can stand beside a reed wall and speak to it. And if a human being on the other side of that wall happens to hear the words, that is not Enki's responsibility. The scene in the Atrahasis epic where Enki speaks to the wall of the reed house is one of the most quietly extraordinary passages in ancient literature. The text gives you the physical details. The reed wall, the night, the god standing just outside it, and Atrahasis inside, listening. Enki speaks in the second person to the wall. Wall, listen to me, and then delivers, through the wall, the instructions that will save the life of one man and the genetic continuity of the species. Tear down your house, build a boat, abandon your possessions, save living things, bring them aboard. The dimensions are specified, the materials are specified, the timing is specified. What Enki does not specify, what the text does not resolve, is the nature of the flood itself, and this is where the Atrahasis account opens onto something larger than a simple weather event. The flood described in the Atrahasis epic is not a rainstorm that got out of hand. The text's description of it, fragmentary as some sections are, involves multiple simultaneous phenomena. There are the waters above, the rain, but there are also what the text calls the waters below, the Abzu, Enki's own domain, rising. There is darkness. There is wind of a violence that the text describes by saying it made the gods themselves afraid. The Anunnaki, watching from above, are not triumphant. They are distressed. The text includes a passage in which the goddess Nintu, one of the divine beings associated with creation, sometimes called the Mother Goddess, weeps at what she's seeing. She watches the flood destroy what she helped to create, and she mourns. This detail, the weeping of Nintu, The fear of the Anunnaki watching from above is not decorative. It tells you that whatever was released in the flood was not entirely under divine control. The assembly had voted to send it, but the scale of what arrived went beyond what even the Anunnaki expected or intended. Something in the mechanics of the catastrophe exceeded the plan. The darkness lasted longer than anticipated. The waters rose higher than the models of the divine assembly had predicted. The Anunnaki, confined to the sky during the event, could not come down. They had to wait, and while they waited, they watched something irreversible happen to the earth below them. The text says that when the flood was over, and the boat grounded and Atrahasis opened the vessel and made his offering, the gods gathered around the sacrifice like flies. It is a raw and unsentimental image. The gods were hungry. The offerings had stopped during the flood because there was no one to make them, and the beings who had created humanity to maintain the divine infrastructure had, in destroying humanity, cut off the very thing that sustained them from the world below. This is the first consequence of the catastrophe that the texts document: the disruption of the reciprocal system. The Anunnaki had built a civilization to generate a steady flow of labour, offerings, ritual maintenance, and devotional attention upward from the human world to the divine. The flood broke that flow, and even after Atrahasis and his family emerged from the boat and re-established the offerings, the infrastructure was gone. The cities were gone. The canals were silted. The temples were buried under mud. The administrative network that had made the pre-flood world function, the network that the king list describes in the language of thousands of years of ordered kingship, had to be rebuilt from almost nothing. It took generations. The post-flood section of the Atrahasis text is shorter and more fragmented than the pre-flood sections, which is itself suggestive. The scribes who transmitted the narrative may have had less material to work with about the rebuilding period, or may have considered the pre-flood world the more important subject. What survives makes clear that the divine assembly, confronted with the aftermath, made accommodations. Enlil, at Enki's urging, allowed the human population to continue, but with modifications. The text introduces new conditions for human life in the post-flood world: shortened lifespan, the institution of certain categories of women who would not bear children, and other mechanisms designed to prevent the population from growing back to the level that had provoked the crisis. These accommodations are, in themselves, a form of withdrawal. The pre-flood world, as the texts describe it, was one in which the Anunnaki were directly present and directly managing. The post-flood world is one in which the Anunnaki establish rules and then step back. The direct administration is replaced by a system of human kings who mediate between the divine and the human, and those kings receive their authority from the gods but exercise it themselves. The gods are now behind a veil that was not there before. The Sumerian king list marks this transition with the simplest possible grammatical notation. Before the flood, the kings ruled for tens of thousands of years. After the flood swept over. Then kingship descended from heaven again, and the reigns drop dramatically. The first post-flood king in the list, a man named Jusha of Kish, reigns for 1200 years. The reigns continue to shorten as the list progresses. By the time the list reaches historical figures whose names appear in other records, and whose reigns can be approximately verified, the lengths have descended into decades. Something contracted after the flood, not just the human lifespan. The entire scale of the administered world contracted. The Enuma Elish, the great Babylonian cosmological epic that opens with the words, "When on high the heaven had not been named, and below the earth had not been called by name," approaches the same structural reality from a different angle. It is primarily a creation narrative, and it positions the flood and the catastrophe within a larger cosmological frame. The ordering of the universe was itself an act of divine violence, the slaying of Tiamat, the primordial chaos ocean, by Marduk, and the construction of the world from her body. In this telling, the creation of humanity comes at the end of the cosmological ordering process, after the physical universe has been established. Humanity is made from the blood of Kingu, Tiamat's general, slain alongside her. What is important about the Enuma Elish in the context of the catastrophe is not its flood narrative. It has one, though it is less detailed than Atrahasis, but its cosmological framing of the Anunnaki's relationship to Earth. In the Enuma Elish, the Anunnaki are beings who are present at the formation of the current cosmic order. They predate the Earth as it now exists. They were there when the primordial waters were divided, when the sky was separated from the Earth, when the calendar was established and the stars were assigned their stations. Their connection to Earth is not incidental or recent. It is foundational, going back to the moment of creation itself, which makes their departure, if the texts are read as describing a real departure, and not simply a metaphorical shift in theological understanding, all the more significant. These are not beings who arrived, stayed for a while, and left when something inconvenient happened. These are beings who, according to the cosmological record the ancient scribes preserved, were present at the very structuring of the world. For something to cause them to withdraw permanently from that world, whatever it was would have had to be of a severity beyond ordinary catastrophe. The ancient texts, read together, suggest that the flood was not the whole of it. The flood was the mechanism. But the catastrophe that resulted in the permanent withdrawal of the Anunnaki from direct engagement with Earth was something that the flood set in motion, a sequence of consequences, physical and structural, that made the pre-flood mode of existence impossible to restore. That sequence is what the next sections of this documentary examine in detail. The city of Nippur sits at the geographic centre of ancient Mesopotamia, equidistant between the northern and southern regions of what is now Iraq, positioned where the Euphrates once ran closer to the city's walls than the dry mound of Nufa that marks the site today. It was never a political capital in the conventional sense. No dynasty of conquerors specifically named Nippur as its seat of power, and yet it was, for more than 3,000 years, the religious and scribal centre of Mesopotamian civilization. The city whose approval legitimized kings, whose temple archives preserved the oldest texts, whose scribal schools trained the men who would copy and transmit the accumulated knowledge of a civilization that considered itself the direct heir of a pre-flood world. The Ekur, the Temple of Enlil at Nippur, was not simply a place of worship. It was an administrative centre, a library, a school, and a repository of cosmic authority. The name means House of the Mountain, and in Sumerian cosmology, the mountain was the place where the divine and the human met, the raised platform, the ziggurat, the artificial peak that brought the human world up toward the register where the Anunnaki operated. Every city in Mesopotamia had its temple, but Nippur's Ekur was different. It was the place where the divine assembly was understood to convene. It was the Ubshukina, the Hall of Fates, made physical in mud, brick and bitumen. Inside that temple, in the room set aside for the scribal archives, the tablets accumulated over centuries, layer after layer of compressed human attention, pressed into clay and then baked, stacked in the storage rooms in categories the ancient librarians themselves had devised. By the time the great libraries of Nippur were at their fullest, in the 2nd millennium BCE, they contained thousands of tablets covering everything from agricultural accounts and legal contracts to hymns, laments, myths, and the great narrative cycles that recorded the history of the world before and after the flood. It is from those archives, and from the parallel archives of Ur, Uruk, Lagash, and later Nineveh, that the primary evidence of this documentary comes, not from one tablet, not from one narrative, but from the accumulated weight of a scribal tradition that returned again and again to the same events, from the same angles and from different angles, across more than 2,000 years of continuous transmission. When that many scribes, in that many cities, across that many generations, keep returning to the same catastrophe and the same departure, the repetition itself is significant. The lament for the destruction of Ur is one of the texts that the Nippur archive preserved in multiple copies, and it is one of the most important documents for understanding the nature of the Anunnaki's withdrawal. It was composed sometime around 2000 BCE, following the destruction of the city of Ur by the Elamites and the Amorites, an event that happened in historical time and can be approximately dated. But the lament does not read as a political document about a military defeat. It reads as a theological document about divine abandonment, and the distinction matters enormously. The text opens with a goddess weeping. Ningol, the consort of the moon god Nana and the divine patroness of Ur, stands in her temple and weeps because she knows what is coming. The text gives her a voice. She speaks in the first person. She describes approaching the divine assembly, first Enlil, then Anu, and pleading with them not to allow the destruction of her city. Her pleas are rejected. The assembly has decreed the destruction of Ur, and the decree cannot be reversed. The language Ningol uses in her plea is specific and worth staying with. She does not ask the gods to fight off the enemy armies. She asks them not to abandon the city. The distinction in the text between the physical destruction by human armies and the prior withdrawal of divine protection is explicit and structural. Ur is destroyed by the Elamites and the Amorites, because the divine protection that had surrounded it was first withdrawn. The armies are the instrument. The withdrawal of the Anunnaki is the cause. The storm that obliterates the land, the lament says, the storm that destroys cities, the raging storm that overwhelms the land, Enlil called this storm. The storm is sometimes understood as the literal military campaign that sacked Ur, and sometimes as something larger and more elemental. A cosmological storm, a fundamental disruption of the conditions that had made the city possible. The lament does not clearly distinguish between these interpretations, and that ambiguity may itself be intentional. The scribes who composed and transmitted the lament for the destruction of Ur were working in a tradition that understood political events and cosmic events as the same kind of thing, operating on different scales simultaneously. What the lament documents, in terms that carry across the distance of 4,000 years with remarkable clarity, is the experience of divine withdrawal. The city is full, the people are present, the temples are standing, and then the protection lifts. The lament describes the moment Ningal's decision to leave her temple, with an attention to physical detail that makes it vivid rather than abstract. Her sandals, her garments, the possessions she takes with her, the ones she leaves behind, the specific sound of the city when the divine presence departs from it. Something changes in the atmosphere of the place. The city is still there, physically unchanged, but the quality of its existence has shifted. And then the armies come, and what was already spiritually emptied is physically destroyed. This pattern, divine withdrawal preceding and enabling physical catastrophe, appears across multiple lament texts from the period. The lament for the destruction of Sumer and Ur, a related but distinct composition, covers the same events from a broader geographic perspective and names multiple cities whose divine patrons have departed. The lament for Nippur describes the withdrawal of Enlil himself from his own primary residence. The lament for Eridu, one of the oldest cities in the tradition, the first city in the king list, describes the departure of Enki from the Abzu, the sacred freshwater precinct at the base of Eridu's temple complex. In each case, the structure is the same. The divine being leaves first, the city is destroyed second. Read together. These lament texts constitute a sustained meditation on a single theological and historical claim. The Anunnaki do not simply fail to protect their cities when catastrophe comes. They actively withdraw before the catastrophe arrives. The catastrophe is not something that overwhelms the divine protection from outside. The withdrawal of the divine protection is the first move. The catastrophe follows from that withdrawal. For the ancient Sumerian and Akkadian scribes, this was not a comforting doctrine. It meant that no human effort, no quality of devotion, no accumulation of offerings and prayers and ritual maintenance could hold the divine beings in place once they had decided to leave. The relationship between the Anunnaki and the earth was not a contract that humanity could enforce. It was a relationship that the Anunnaki could terminate unilaterally, and the texts record that they did so, partially after the Great Flood and progressively thereafter, city by city, temple by temple across the centuries. The theological question embedded in this pattern is not one the ancient scribes asked directly. They did not write philosophical treatises about the justice or injustice of divine withdrawal. But the laments themselves carry an implicit question in every line. Why did they leave? What made the Anunnaki, beings who had, according to the oldest traditions, invested an enormous expenditure of divine energy in building the infrastructure of civilization on Earth, decide to withdraw from it? The Atrahasis epic gives one answer: the noise, the rigmu, the intolerable pressure of human proliferation. But the flood that was supposed to solve that problem did not solve it cleanly. The flood created its own catastrophe within the divine order. And understanding that secondary catastrophe, the catastrophe within the catastrophe, requires looking at a specific passage in the Atrahasis text that is sometimes passed over in favour of the more dramatic flood narrative itself. After the floodwaters recede, after Atrahasis opens his boat and makes his offerings and the gods gather around the sacrifice like flies, there is a confrontation. Enlil sees the boat. Enlil sees that a human being has survived. And Enlil is furious. The text says his anger fills the sky. He turns on the assembly and demands to know who told the human. The question is rhetorical. He knows it was Enki. And Enki's response in this passage is one of the most direct statements of divine self-criticism in ancient literature. He does not deny what he did. He defends it. He argues that the flood was excessive, He argues that the punishment did not fit the problem. He argues in essence that the divine assembly made an error. This is significant for the question of the Anunnaki's permanent departure from Earth, because it establishes that the flood was not a moment of divine unity, but a moment of divine fracture. The assembly that had operated as the governing body of the Earth's civilization was, after the flood, divided between those who had voted for total destruction and those, led by Enki, who had found that they could not bring themselves to accept that outcome. The Anunnaki, who had wept during the flood, who had gone hungry during it, who had watched from the sky while the world they built was obliterated, came out of the event changed. Something in the mechanics of their relationship to the Earth had shifted. The post-flood compromise Enlil accepts allow some humans to survive, but institute new limits on their lifespan and reproduction is not a return to the pre-flood arrangement. It is a new arrangement, and a new arrangement requires a new distance. The Anunnaki who come back to receive offerings after the flood are not the same Anunnaki who walked in the pre-flood cities. The intimacy, the directness, the operational presence recorded in the oldest layers of the tradition. These are things the lament texts mourn because they are things that are no longer present. The flood did not simply reduce the human population, it introduced a structural gap between the divine world and the human world that had not existed before. That gap is what the ancient scribes, working in the centuries after the flood, were trying to describe and to understand. They had access to traditions that said the pre-flood world was different, that the Anunnaki were present in a way they no longer were. The king list's dramatic compression of post-flood reigns compared to pre-flood reigns is one expression of that gap. The lament text's recurring structure of divine withdrawal, preceding destruction, is another. The institution of priesthood itself, a class of human specialists whose entire function is to mediate between the human world and the divine world, is a practical response to the existence of that gap. You need intermediaries only when direct contact is no longer available. In the pre-flood world, according to the texts, the king was not primarily an intermediary. The king was an administrator, someone who carried out the decisions of the divine assembly in the physical world, but who did so in a context where the Anunnaki were also present and active in that same physical world. The king received instructions. The post-flood king receives instructions differently, through omens, through dreams, through the interpretation of signs, through the mediation of priests. The channel has narrowed. The signal is weaker and requires specialists to decode it. This narrowing of the channel between the divine and the human is itself a consequence of the catastrophe, and the texts that document it do so not with the language of finality, not with the language of the Anunnaki are gone forever, but with the language of grief and displacement. The divine beings are still real, still present in the cosmological structure, still the authors of the fates that govern human life, but they are no longer here in the way they were, and the here-ness of their former presence is precisely what the lament texts mourn with such sustained intensity. The lament for Eridu is particularly raw on this point. Eridu, the oldest city, the city where kingship first descended from heaven, the city of Enki and the Abzu. When Enki leaves that city, the text describes the departure in terms that strip away any theological abstraction and leave you with something that reads more like the account of a person abandoning a home they built with their own hands. The rites are interrupted. The offerings are not taken up. The sacred boat that was used in the rituals of the Abzu sits in the canal, no longer needed, beginning to dry out. The fish that gathered in the sacred precinct disperse. The water in the Abzu changes quality, and the human inhabitants of Eridu, left without the divine presence that had oriented their entire existence, do not know what to do. That image, the boat in the canal, the fish dispersing, the water changing, is worth holding on to as this documentary moves into the next phase of the catastrophe narrative. Because what the lament texts collectively describe is not just a theological event. They describe physical changes in the landscape, in the water, in the quality of the environment that accompanied the divine withdrawal. The catastrophe was not only cosmic, it was also geological. The southern marshlands of Mesopotamia, in the period the ancient texts describe, were not the same landscape that exists today, and they were not the same landscape that existed even 2,000 years after the flood narratives were first composed. The geography of the region has shifted repeatedly over the span of human civilization, driven by the slow accumulation of river sediment, by changes in sea level, by the shifting courses of the Tigris and the Euphrates, and by events of abrupt and violent geological change that left their signatures in the stratigraphy of the land itself. Understanding what the ancient texts describe when they speak of the flood requires understanding what kind of landscape the flood fell upon, and what that landscape looked like when the waters finally receded. The Persian Gulf, during the period archaeologists and geologists now call the early Holocene, roughly the 10,000 years following the end of the last ice age, was a fundamentally different body of water than the one that exists today. At the peak of the last glacial maximum, around 21,000 years ago, sea levels globally were somewhere between 100 and 120 metres lower than they are now. The floor of what is now the Persian Gulf was dry land. The Tigris and the Euphrates, along with the rivers draining from the Zagros Mountains to the east and the Arabian Peninsula to the south, converged in a river system that ran across that exposed floor and emptied into the Indian Ocean far to the south of the current Gulf mouth. That river valley, sometimes called the Gulf Oasis by researchers working on the paleoclimate of the region, would have been one of the most habitable places on Earth during the glacial period. Freshwater, relatively temperate climate, rich in vegetation and animal life compared to the arid plateau region surrounding it. As the glaciers retreated and sea levels rose, the Gulf flooded. The flooding was not instantaneous, but it was not entirely gradual either. There is geological evidence for periods of accelerated inundation, particularly around 8,000 to 6,000 years before the present, when the rate of sea level rise was faster than the global average in this region due to the configuration of the coastline and the shallow gradient of the Gulf floor. The coastline moved inland at rates that, on a human timescale, would have been perceptible within a single lifetime. Communities that had existed near the water's edge for generations found themselves with the water at their doorsteps within decades, and then with the water over their heads within a century or two. The ancient city of Eridu sits on a low mound in the southern Iraqi desert, and when archaeologists excavated that mound in the 20th century, they found beneath the oldest visible mud brick architecture a sequence of occupation levels going back to the 6th millennium BCE, among the earliest evidence of permanent settlement in Mesopotamia. But they also found, at certain depths, layers of clean river-deposited silt interrupting the occupation layers. Silt with no artifacts in it. Silt of the kind that water leaves behind when it covers a surface and then recedes. These flood deposits appear at Ur as well, famously, and at other southern Mesopotamian sites. They are not all the same age. The flood events they record are multiple and separated in time, but their presence in the stratigraphy of the oldest inhabited sites in the region is a physical confirmation that the landscape of ancient Mesopotamia experienced repeated inundations of significant scale. The Sumerian texts do not describe one flood. The Atrahasis epic describes the Great Flood as the last in a sequence of divine interventions, each one more severe than the last. The Sumerian king list describes the flood as a singular event. The flood swept over, but the archaeological record of the region suggests a landscape that experienced multiple flood events across the span of millennia. The relationship between the singular flood of the textual tradition and the multiple flood deposits of the geological record is one of the genuinely open questions in the study of these narratives. What is not open is the fact that the landscape of southern Mesopotamia was, across the period in which the earliest Sumerian civilization developed, a landscape under constant hydrological stress, a landscape where the relationship between the land and the water was never fully stable. This instability is directly relevant to what the lament texts describe when they record the withdrawal of the Anunnaki. Eridu's Abzu, the sacred freshwater precinct in the deepest part of Enki's temple, the place where the underground ocean was understood to be accessible, was a real hydrological feature as well as a cosmological one. The water table in southern Mesopotamia was, and in some areas still is, very close to the surface. Digging down a few meters in the right location would produce water. The Sumerians built their understanding of the underground ocean, the Abzu, the source of all fresh water, on a genuine geological reality, the freshwater aquifer that underlies the alluvial plain of Mesopotamia, and that, in the oldest periods of settlement, was accessible in the low-lying areas near the ancient coastline. When the lament texts describe changes in the quality of the water in the Abzu after the divine departure, they are describing something that could correspond to a real environmental change: salinization. As the sea level rose and the Gulf pushed further inland, the saltwater intrusion into the coastal aquifer would have increased. The freshwater springs that had fed the sacred precincts of the oldest cities, Eridu most notably, but also Ur and other sites in the deep south, would have become brackish and then salty. The fish that had gathered in the freshwater precincts would have disappeared. The water that had made the deep south of Mesopotamia habitable and sacred would have changed its character. The lament for Eridu in the light of this geological context reads differently than it does as pure theology. The boat sitting unused in the canal, the fish dispersing, the water changing. These are not only metaphors for divine absence. They are descriptions of a real environmental deterioration that would have been visible and tangible to the people living through it. The divine departure and the physical deterioration of the landscape are narrated together in the text because, for the people experiencing them, they were the same event experienced on two registers simultaneously. The Enuma Elish adds another layer to this geological reading of the catastrophe. The primordial condition that the Enuma Elish describes before the creation of the ordered world is the commingling of the salt waters, Tiamat, and the fresh waters, Apsu. The two primordial oceans are mixed together, not yet separated. The act of cosmic creation is precisely the separation and organization of these waters. Marduk defeats Tiamat and uses her body to construct the physical universe, the sky above, the earth below, the waters held in their proper places. What the Enuma Elish describes as the primordial chaos is, in geological terms, something very close to the condition of a low-lying coastal plain during a period of marine transgression. Salt water and fresh water mixing, land and sea not yet clearly distinguished, the boundary between them unstable and shifting. The flood, read in this cosmological context, is not simply a punishment. It is a temporary return to primordial chaos, a reversal of the creative act that Marduk performed when he organized the world from Tiamat's body. The waters that were separated in the act of creation are briefly reunited in the act of the flood, and when they separate again, the world that emerges is not quite the same as the one that existed before. The separation is not as clean. The boundaries between land and water, between the ordered and the chaotic, have been disturbed in ways that do not fully resolve. In Sumerian cosmology, the Anunnaki are beings who operate within the ordered world, the world that was created by the separation of the primordial waters. Their presence on Earth is contingent on the maintenance of that ordered state. When the flood temporarily returns the world to primordial chaos, the Anunnaki withdraw to the sky, not because they choose to leave in a casual sense, but because the conditions of their presence in the physical world have been disrupted. The ordering that made their habitation of the Earth possible has been undone. The question is whether, after the waters recede and the ordering partially reasserts itself, the conditions for their return are restored. The texts suggest they are not fully. The post-flood world is an ordered world, but it is ordered at a lower level than the pre-flood world. The canals are rebuilt, but not to the same depth. The temples are restored, but not to the same size. The reigns of kings are long, but not as long as before. The connection between the divine and the human is restored, but not at the same bandwidth. Something was lost in the flood that could not be recovered by the work of reconstruction, no matter how diligent and devoted that work was. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the most widely distributed of all ancient Mesopotamian narratives, surviving in versions from Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Levant, copied across more than 1,000 years, approaches this same reality from the perspective of a human king who refuses to accept it. Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, is described in the text's opening lines as a man who knew everything, who had seen all things, who had travelled to the ends of the earth. He is 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, a post-flood being who carries within his own biology the memory of a closer proximity to the divine that no longer exists in the world around him. The death of his companion Enkidu drives Gilgamesh to seek what the texts say was given to humanity before the flood and taken away after it: immortality, or more precisely, the unlimited lifespan that the pre-flood kings held. He travels to the edge of the world. He passes through the mountains of Mashu, where the scorpion people guard the passage between the mortal world and the divine. He crosses the waters of death, and he finds, at the end of his journey, Utnapishtim, the Babylonian Atrahasis, the man who survived the flood, living at the mouth of the rivers in a place the text calls far away, at the confluence of the waters. Utnapishtim is the one human being who was given immortality by the gods after the flood, as a reward and as an anomaly. He is the last living link to the pre-flood world. Gilgamesh's conversation with Utnapishtim is one of the central documents for understanding the Anunnaki's departure. Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh directly what the texts elsewhere say, only by implication. The gift that was given to him will not be given to Gilgamesh. The assembly of the gods made a decision at the time of the flood, and the terms of that decision still hold. The unlimited lifespan of the pre-flood world belongs to the pre-flood world. Gilgamesh is a post-flood being, and the post-flood world operates by post-flood rules. No amount of heroism, no degree of divine ancestry, no journey to the ends of the earth can restore what the flood permanently recalibrated. Utnapishtim offers Gilgamesh one chance. There is a plant that grows at the bottom of the sea. The text calls it the plant of heartbeat, the plant of rejuvenation. And if Gilgamesh can retrieve it, it will restore youth, if not immortality. Gilgamesh dives for it. He finds it. He ties stones to his feet to reach the bottom of the sea, and he pulls the plant from its roots in the deep. He carries it back across the waters of death. And then, on the way home, he stops to bathe in a cool pool, and while he sleeps, a serpent comes and takes the plant. The serpent sheds its skin and disappears. Gilgamesh weeps. The plant that grows at the bottom of the sea, accessible only by going to a place beyond the normal boundaries of the human world, retrievable only through heroic effort, and then lost to an animal before it can be used, is one of the most compressed images in ancient literature for the nature of what was lost in the catastrophe. It existed. It was real. It was reachable in principle, but the conditions of the post-flood world conspired against its recovery. The serpent that takes it is not a villain. It is the embodiment of the natural order of the post-flood world, which includes death, which includes the shedding of what was and the emergence of what now is. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk with nothing he did not already have. He returns to his city. He stands at the walls of Uruk, and the text, in one of its oldest sections, has him invite his ferryman to look at the walls with him, to see what was built, to see the baked bricks that will last, to see the foundations that were laid. The city is the achievement. The city is what remains, not immortality, not the direct presence of the Anunnaki, not the unlimited lifespan of the pre-flood kings, but the walls of Uruk, standing in the evening light, built from the same earth that the flood covered and uncovered. There is a text that does not appear in the standard collections of Mesopotamian mythology as often as the Atrahasis epic or the Epic of Gilgamesh, and that receives less attention in general discussions of the flood tradition, but that is, for the purposes of understanding the Anunnaki's permanent departure, one of the most revealing documents in the entire cuneiform archive. It is called the Era Epic, sometimes the Era and Ishum Epic, and it survives in a reasonably complete state across multiple tablet sets from the 1st millennium BCE, though its composition is generally placed in the early 1st millennium or the late 2nd millennium. It is a narrative about destruction, not the flood, but a different catastrophe, one that the text presents as happening within historical or near-historical time, and it is unique in the ancient Mesopotamian textual tradition for the directness with which it describes the Anunnaki's deliberate withdrawal from Earth as a decision made in response to specific conditions. The protagonist of the Era epic is not a human being, it is a god. Era is the god of violence and plague, associated with the destructive aspects of war and epidemic, and the text presents him as a being who has grown restless. The other gods, and specifically Marduk, who by the 1st millennium had become the chief deity of the Babylonian pantheon, and who occupied a role analogous to the pre-Babylonian Enlil as executive of the divine assembly, have withdrawn from active engagement with the earth. Marduk himself, in a passage that is extraordinary for its candour about the state of the divine-human relationship, explains why he left his own temple. The statue of Marduk in his great temple at Babylon, the Asargala, was considered the physical residence of the god, the place where Marduk was present in the world in a tangible sense. In the Era epic, Marduk describes leaving that statue, leaving the Asargala, and the consequences that followed his departure. When he left, he says, the heavens shook. The stars moved from their established positions, the rivers changed their courses, the earth quaked. The regulations that governed the world, the divine decrees that established the rules of civilized existence, became confused. Things that should have stayed in place did not stay in place. The ordered world that had been established after the flood, imperfect as it was compared to the pre-flood arrangement, began to destabilize when the divine presence withdrew from it. Marduk's explanation for why he left is specific. He left because his regalia had become dirty. The crown, the garments, the symbols of divine authority that were kept in the temple had accumulated the contamination of the post-flood world, a contamination the text describes in terms of impurity and neglect, but that carries within it a suggestion of something more fundamental. The physical medium through which the divine presence was anchored to the earth had degraded, and without going to the Apsu, the underground sacred waters, Enki's domain, to restore those symbols to their proper state, Marduk could not fully return. The restoration of the divine regalia required access to conditions that the post-flood world no longer reliably provided. This is a different register of explanation than the one in the Atrahasis epic. In Atrahasis, the Anunnaki leave because they have decided to destroy. In the Era epic, Marduk describes leaving because the physical conditions of his presence in the world have deteriorated. The temple is there, the statue is there, but the quality of connection between the divine and the physical substrate through which that connection was maintained has degraded to the point where the divine being can no longer properly inhabit it. The withdrawal is not a punishment delivered to humanity from outside. It is the result of an internal failure of the mechanism through which the Anunnaki were present in the world. This distinction is crucial for understanding what the catastrophe actually was in the cumulative testimony of the ancient texts. The Great Flood was the precipitating event, but what it precipitated was not simply a divine decision to step back. It precipitated a physical degradation of the conditions through which the Anunnaki's presence on Earth was sustained. The Me, the divine decrees, the fundamental organizing principles of civilization, were disrupted by the flood in ways that could not be fully repaired. The sacred precincts, the regalia, the channels through which divine authority flowed into the physical world were contaminated and damaged by the catastrophe. And the Anunnaki, beings whose existence was ordered and structured in ways that required those channels to be clean and functional, found themselves progressively less able to maintain the kind of presence in the post-flood world that they had maintained before it. Era, the god of violence, grows restless in this diminished arrangement. He is a being whose nature requires action, requires destruction, requires the kind of direct engagement with the physical world that the other Anunnaki have stepped back from. And the Era epic presents his restlessness as a danger, because if Era acts without the framework of the Divine Assembly's governance, the destruction he causes will be not organized and purposeful, as the flood was supposed to be, but random and total. His companion Ishum, a god of fire and also of more measured counsel, tries to restrain him, but Era eventually acts, and the destruction he brings is described in the text with the same vocabulary that the lament texts use for the fall of cities: the streets filled with the dead, the temples abandoned, the divine protectors withdrawn. The Era epic ends with a restoration. Era is calmed, the destruction stops, the cities begin to recover, but the restoration is explicitly partial. The text does not promise a return to the conditions that existed before. It promises only that things will be somewhat better than they are at the moment of maximum destruction. The baseline has shifted. Each catastrophe in the Mesopotamian textual tradition leaves the world at a slightly lower level of ordered existence than it occupied before the catastrophe struck. The flood left the world at a lower level than the pre-flood age. The destructions described in the lament texts left individual cities at a lower level. The chaos described in the Era epic leaves the first millennium world at a lower level still. The movement is consistently in one direction. This progressive degradation, catastrophe by catastrophe, the conditions of the world declining from the state in which the Anunnaki first established civilization on it, is one of the most consistent structural features of the Mesopotamian textual tradition when read across its full span. The Sumerians did not have a concept of linear progress toward a better future. They had a concept of decline from a better past. The pre-flood world was the closest the earth had come to the divine order. Each subsequent period was further from it, and the Anunnaki's progressive withdrawal was both a symptom of that decline and one of its causes, because without the direct divine presence, the conditions of civilization continued to deteriorate, and without the conditions of civilization at a sufficient level of order and purity, the divine presence could not return. The hymns of the Sumerian kings who came after the flood, particularly the kings of the third dynasty of Ur, who ruled in the century around 2100 BCE, and who were among the most prolific commissioners of cuneiform literature in Mesopotamian history, are full of this tension. The kings present themselves as divinely chosen, divinely anointed, recipients of the divine authority that descends from the Anunnaki through the institution of kingship. They use language that suggests intimacy with the gods. Shulgi of Ur, one of the most celebrated of these kings, calls himself the beloved of Nana, the chosen of Enlil, the one who daily enters the presence of the divine. His hymns describe experiences of direct divine contact, but the language of those hymns, read carefully, reveals the gap it is trying to close. Shulgi describes going to the temple and being in the divine presence, but the going to the temple is itself significant. The pre-flood kings, in the tradition the Sumerian king list preserves, did not go to the divine presence. The divine presence was simply present. It was ambient. It was the condition of the pre-flood world rather than a destination within the post-flood world. Shulgi's insistence on his divine intimacy is the insistence of a man who has to work for something that once required no work at all. The hymns also reveal, in their more unguarded moments, an anxiety about the stability of that divine intimacy. There are passages in the Shulgi hymns where the king describes the possibility that the divine favour might be withdrawn, that Enlil might turn away, that Nana might cease to look upon the city with favour. This anxiety is not present in the oldest layers of the tradition. The pre-flood kings, as the king list presents them, do not appear to worry about losing divine favour. The divine order is simply the condition of their existence. The post-flood kings worry constantly. The worry is itself a marker of the gap. In the city of Lagash, in the period of the king Gudea, who ruled sometime around 2100 BCE, roughly contemporary with the third dynasty of Ur, there is a remarkable set of texts that describe the construction of a new temple for the god Ningirsu. Gudea receives the commission in a dream. The dream is elaborate and specific. A divine figure appears and gives him detailed architectural instructions for the temple, including its dimensions, its orientation, its materials, and the ritual procedures that must accompany its construction. Gudea spends enormous resources on the project, importing cedar from the mountains of Lebanon, diorite from Magan, gold from the highlands. He mobilizes the labor of his entire city. He documents the process in texts that survive on large stone cylinders and that are among the longest continuous Sumerian compositions ever found. The purpose of all this effort is explicit in the text. Gudea is trying to create the conditions under which Ningirsu will actually come and inhabit the temple, not symbolically, not in the abstract theological sense of a divine presence accessible through prayer and ritual. The text describes the goal as the actual arrival of the god in the physical space of the temple, an arrival that would make the temple function not as a place where humans approach the divine, but as a place where the divine is present and active in the world. And the text records that the arrival happened. Ningirsu came. The city of Lagash, for the period of Gudea's reign, is described in the hymns as a city in which the divine presence was restored at something approaching its proper intensity. The sick were healed. The crops were good. The rivers were full. Justice was maintained. The city functioned as the pre-flood cities had functioned, according to the tradition, as a properly ordered human community under direct divine superintendence. But Gudea's reign ended. His son ruled after him, and then his son's son, and then the third dynasty of Ur rose to dominance, and eventually the dynasty of Lagash was absorbed into the larger political structure of southern Mesopotamia. The divine presence that Gudea had worked so hard to restore in his city did not persist as a permanent feature of the post-flood world. It was a moment, not a restoration, a brief return achieved through extraordinary effort that then faded back into the ordinary conditions of the post-flood age. The contrast between Gudea's achievement and its impermanence is itself one of the most honest statements in the cuneiform archive about the nature of the Anunnaki's departure. It was not a departure with a locked door. The texts do not say the Anunnaki are gone and cannot come back. What the texts describe, collectively, is a departure that has raised the threshold of return to a level that ordinary human civilization cannot consistently maintain. The conditions required for direct divine presence, the purity of the sacred precincts, the proper functioning of the me, the maintenance of the channels through which divine authority flows into the physical world, are conditions that the post-flood world can achieve only briefly, through extraordinary collective effort, and that it cannot sustain. Gudea builds his temple with imported cedar and diorite and gold, mobilizes his entire city, follows dream instructions to the letter, and achieves a temporary restoration. The pre-flood world did not require cedar from Lebanon and diorite from Magan. The pre-flood world was, according to the texts, simply ordered correctly from the beginning by the Anunnaki who built it. The post-flood world requires constant heroic effort just to approach the threshold of the conditions the pre-flood world maintained as its baseline. And when that effort relaxes, even slightly, the threshold is not reached, and the divine presence retreats again to its post-flood distance. The question of what exactly happened to the Anunnaki after the flood, whether they truly abandoned the earth permanently or whether they withdrew to a distance so great that the distinction became functionally meaningless, is addressed directly in one of the oldest Sumerian compositions in the cuneiform archive, a text called The Descent of Inanna. The text describes the journey of Inanna, one of the younger Anunnaki, into the underworld. She leaves the upper world, passes through 7 gates, and enters a realm from which she does not immediately return. Her absence from the upper world is felt. The cycles of fertility stop, the crops do not grow, the animals do not reproduce. The world above becomes static, suspended in a kind of sterility, waiting for her return. Inanna does return, eventually, but the text makes clear that her return is conditional and time-limited. She must return to the upper world for part of each year, and then return to the underworld for the other part. The arrangement is not one of permanent restoration, it is one of seasonal oscillation, a compromise between the demands of the underworld and the needs of the upper world. Inanna is present, but not permanently present. She's available, but not always available. The descent of Inanna is frequently interpreted as a myth, explaining the seasonal cycle of vegetation, the death and return of plants with the changing seasons. And that interpretation is not wrong. But it is also a story about divine presence and divine absence, and about the way that the post-flood arrangement of the Anunnaki's relationship to Earth came to function as a system of periodic withdrawal and return rather than as a permanent, continuous presence. The fertility of the world, the most basic requirement for human civilization to sustain itself, became dependent on the movements of the Anunnaki between the upper world and the underworld, between the realm of the living and the realm of the dead. The divine presence could no longer simply remain in the world. It had to constantly move, to oscillate, to visit and then depart again. The underworld itself, called the Kur in Sumerian texts, or the land of no return, is an important conceptual space for understanding the Anunnaki's departure. In the oldest Sumerian cosmology, the underworld is not a place of punishment. It is a place of reality. It is where things go when they leave the realm of action and change, where they become fixed, stable, unchanging. The living world is a world of flux, of becoming, of things moving toward or away from the divine presence. The underworld is the realm where process stops, and in the post-flood texts, the Anunnaki increasingly come to be associated with the underworld as much as with the upper world. They become beings who move between the two realms, no longer simply present in the upper world, but constantly oscillating between presence and absence, activity and stillness, the realm of change and the realm of fixity. This shift in how the Anunnaki are positioned in the cosmology is one of the most significant markers of the permanent nature of their withdrawal. They do not disappear, they do not become inaccessible, but they become beings whose presence is no longer the baseline condition of existence in the post-flood world. Their presence becomes something that must be achieved through ritual, through the proper performance of the me, through maintaining the channels of communication and the sacred precincts in a state of purity. And their absence becomes the ordinary state, the state that reasserts itself whenever the effort to maintain communication is relaxed or the channels become polluted. The role of the priesthood in the post-flood world emerges from this fundamental shift. The priest is not a mediator in the sense of bringing the divine and human worlds together. The divine and human worlds have already been separated by the flood. The priest is, rather, a specialist in maintaining the narrow channels of communication that still remain, and in interpreting the fragmentary signals that come through those channels. The priest reads omens. The priest performs rituals at the appointed times. The priest maintains the regalia of the god in the temple. The priest ensures that the offerings are made at the correct moments and in the correct manner. All of this is necessary because the direct communication that existed in the pre-flood world is no longer simply available. The appointment of priests in Sumerian cities was itself a divine act, according to the texts. A human being would be called to priesthood through a dream, through a sign, through direct divine instruction, and that calling took precedence over all other claims on that person. The priest belonged to the god. The priest's body was the instrument through which the god continued to act in the physical world. And the texts make clear that this was not a metaphor. The priest was literally inhabited by the divine presence during certain rituals and certain moments of the day. The god was present in the priest, speaking through the priest's mouth, moving through the priest's body, accomplishing divine purposes through the priest's actions. But even this residual presence, the presence of the Anunnaki in the body of a human priest during specific ritual moments in specific sacred spaces, is dependent on extraordinary conditions. The priest must be in a state of ritual purity. The temple must be in a state of ritual purity. The offerings must be of the correct kind and quality. The words of the ritual must be performed correctly, with no errors, no hesitations, no deviations from the prescribed form. If any of these conditions fails, the presence does not come, the priest remains empty, the god does not arrive, and the world outside the temple continues in the ordinariness of the post-flood age, where the divine presence is not directly accessible. In the city of Nippur, where the Ekur, the temple of Enlil, stood as the religious center of Mesopotamian civilization, the maintenance of these conditions was treated as a matter of civilizational survival. The Ekur was not simply a temple. It was understood to be the place where the decisions of the universe were made, where the me were established, where the fates of kings and cities were determined. The priesthood of the Ekur was not simply a religious institution. It was understood to be the administrative apparatus through which the divine governance of the world was channeled into effect. If the Ekur fell into disrepair, if its priesthood became corrupted or incompetent, if its rituals were not maintained at their proper level, the consequences would not be merely spiritual, they would be cosmic. The entire order of civilization would begin to deteriorate. This is why the lament texts record the destruction of cities with such theological weight. When Nippur was damaged or when the Ekur was threatened, the laments describe it not as a local military event but as a cosmic catastrophe. When the priesthood fled and the rituals were not performed, the world itself began to come undone. The boundaries between the ordered and the chaotic started to blur. The me became confused. The stars moved from their assigned positions. The rivers changed their courses. What had been stable became unstable. What had been organized became chaotic. And at the center of every such disruption was the same phenomenon, the withdrawal of the Anunnaki, not their destruction, not their death, but their departure from the places where they had been actively present. The god left the temple. The priesthood fled. The rituals could not be performed. And in the vacuum of that absence, the chaos of the post-flood world, held back only by constant effort and constant vigilance, began to surge forward again. There is a text from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, a text from the 7th century BCE, more than 2,000 years after the great flood narratives were first composed, that describes the experience of a priest whose god has abandoned him. The text is fragmentary, but the voice of the priest comes through in it with an anguish that echoes across the millennia. The god has left. The priest goes to the temple, performs the rituals perfectly, speaks the correct words, makes the correct offerings, and nothing happens. The god does not come. The priest waits in the darkness of the temple, and the divine presence does not arrive. He is alone in the space that is supposed to be the habitation of the god, and the god is not there. The priest's response in the text is not to conclude that the god has ceased to exist, or that the god is no longer real. The priest's response is to assume that he has failed in some way, that there is some impurity he has not seen, some error in the ritual he has not noticed, some way in which he has fallen short. The priest redoubles his efforts. He performs the rituals again. He makes additional offerings. He searches his own life for the transgression that has caused the god to withdraw. And still the god does not come. This text, the experience of the priest abandoned by his god, desperately trying to restore a connection that has been severed, is one of the most poignant documents of the post-flood age. It shows the theology of the Anunnaki's withdrawal from the inside, from the perspective of someone whose entire existence was predicated on the presence of a divine being who has become progressively unavailable. The god did not die in the flood. The god did not vanish. But the god became inaccessible in a way that is, for practical purposes, indistinguishable from abandonment. The texts that record this experience do not present it as a failure of the divine being. They present it as a failure of the post-flood world to maintain the conditions under which the divine presence could be sustained. The Anunnaki did not leave because they had grown tired or indifferent or hostile. They left because the catastrophe had so fundamentally altered the nature of physical reality on Earth that the conditions of their presence, the conditions that the oldest texts describe as given and natural in the pre-flood world, had become impossible to maintain on a permanent basis. They could be restored briefly, through extraordinary effort. They could be approximated through ritual and priesthood, but they could not be restored as the baseline condition of existence, and so the Anunnaki's departure became permanent, not because they ceased to be real or ceased to care, but because the world itself had changed in ways that made their permanent presence impossible. The Great Catastrophe was not simply the flood. It was the remaking of the world in the flood's aftermath, the salinization of the sacred waters, the destruction of the cities, the loss of the temple regalia, the degradation of the channels through which divine authority flowed into the physical world. The flood was the precipitating event, but the permanent departure was the consequence of a world that could no longer sustain what it had once sustained. This is what the ancient Sumerian and Akkadian scribes, working in the centuries and millennia after the flood, were trying to communicate when they returned again and again to the same narratives, copied them into new tablets, transmitted them to new generations, and insisted on their importance. They were not recording a simple historical event that had passed and was done with. They were recording the nature of the world they lived in, a world that had been changed by the catastrophe in ways that were still being experienced in their own time, that would continue to be experienced as long as civilization lasted. The transmission of the flood narrative across more than 2,000 years of cuneiform scribal tradition was not haphazard or accidental. The texts appear in the archives of cities from the southern marshes of Mesopotamia to the highlands of Anatolia. They appear in Sumerian, in Akkadian, in Hittite, in versions that were deliberately copied and recopied because the scribes and the kings who commissioned them understood that these narratives carried something essential about the nature of the world. The flood was not merely ancient history, it was the defining event that explained why the world worked the way it worked in the present moment, why the Anunnaki were not visibly present, why human beings had to work so hard to maintain civilization, why everything that was built was perpetually threatened with collapse. The scribes of Nippur, who worked in the period of the Third Dynasty of Ur, around 2100 BCE, roughly 400 years after the flood would have occurred if the catastrophe that triggered the texts was a historical event, were not recording mythology. They were recording something they understood to be verifiable history, transmitted through an unbroken chain of scribal transmission from the pre-flood world. The Sumerian king list, which they were copying and preserving, claimed to be a document of kingship itself, an official record of who ruled and for how long. The Atrahasis epic was preserved in the temple archives of Nippur because it was understood to contain authoritative information about the nature of human existence and the terms under which civilization was permitted to exist on Earth. This sense that the flood narratives were not mythological but historical, or at least not mythological in the sense of being false or merely imaginative, was shared across the entire cuneiform civilization. When the Hittites, a people whose primary language and cultural traditions were Indo-European rather than Semitic or Sumerian, came into contact with the Mesopotamian textual tradition, they copied the flood narratives and incorporated them into their own religious archive. When the Akkadian scribes of the Old Babylonian period took the older Sumerian compositions and rewrote them in their own language, they did not do so as translators adapting myth into contemporary idiom. They did so as archivists preserving authoritative records. The Akkadian version of the Atrahasis narrative, sometimes called the Atrahasis epic in its Akkadian form to distinguish it from the earlier Sumerian compositions that form its textual foundation, was itself considered so authoritative that it was copied across the entire span of the second millennium BCE, appearing in archives from Babylon to Boghaz-Köi to the Mediterranean coast. Kings commissioned copies, scribal schools used it as a teaching text. The narrative was woven into the foundation mythology of multiple dynasties and multiple cities, and every copy preserved the same structural insistence. This is what happened. This is why the world is as it is. This is what you must understand about the relationship between the divine and the human, between the ordered and the chaotic, between the world as it was and the world as it is. the specificity with which the texts describe the pre-flood world, the length of the rains, the names of the cities, the names of the kings, the sequence of divine interventions, is one of the most striking features of the entire tradition. The Sumerian king list does not present the pre-flood world vaguely. It does not say, in ancient times. It gives numbers. It names names. It insists that the pre-flood world was not a symbolic or allegorical past, but a real past that operated according to rules that can be specified and understood. The first king of Eridu reigned for 28,800 years. That is not a poetic way of saying a very long time. That is a number. It is a claim. Modern scholars have puzzled over these numbers for more than a century, since the king list became widely known in the academic world. Some have proposed that the numbers represent cycles of a different kind of time, divine time or cosmic time rather than human years. Others have argued that the numbers are the result of numerological systems or astronomical symbolism embedded in the traditional transmission. Still others have simply set the numbers aside as an artifact of mythological thinking and focused on the narrative structures as the real content of the texts. But the ancient Sumerian and Akkadian scribes did not set the numbers aside. They preserved them. They copied them faithfully. They insisted on them. And in doing so, they were insisting on a claim about the nature of the pre-flood world that is central to understanding the catastrophe. The pre-flood world was not simply a different kind of place. It was a place organized at a fundamentally different scale. Time itself operated differently. The lifespans of beings were different. The rate at which events unfolded was different. And the Anunnaki, who ruled during that period, were beings whose nature was scaled to that different world. When the flood came and the waters receded, and the post-flood world emerged, that change of scale was one of the most profound of all the transformations. Not only were the cities destroyed and the infrastructure of civilization broken, not only was the connection between the divine and the human disrupted, the very scale at which the world operated was compressed. The reigns of kings dropped from tens of thousands of years to thousands of years to hundreds of years to decades. The lifespan of human beings dropped from centuries or more to decades. The rate at which things happened accelerated. The world sped up, and the Anunnaki, beings whose nature had been scaled to operate in that older, slower, larger world, found themselves unable to function in a world that was now operating at a different speed entirely. To use a modern analogy that the ancient texts do not use but that captures something of the structural reality they describe, the Anunnaki were beings calibrated to operate in a world of deep time, centuries-long processes, gradual changes in the positions of stars and rivers. The post-flood world was a world of rapid change, where cities could be built and destroyed in decades, where the meaning and structure of civilization could shift within a single human lifetime. The mismatch between the Anunnaki's nature and the post-flood world's operating conditions was not something that could be resolved through effort or goodwill. It was a fundamental incompatibility. This incompatibility appears in the texts in the increasing distance between the Anunnaki and humanity as the post-flood period progresses. In the oldest traditions, the Anunnaki make decisions about humanity. They create the human being. They assign the human being to labor. They monitor the human population. They interact with humans directly, speaking to them, instructing them, even, in the case of Enki, circumventing their own assembly's decisions on behalf of human beings. In these oldest texts, the Anunnaki are actively engaged with the human world at the level of specific decisions and specific moments. By the time of the Third Dynasty of Ur, 3 or 4 centuries after the flood would have occurred, the Anunnaki are much more distant figures. They are still real, they still make decisions that matter, but the decisions are made through intermediaries, through the priesthood, through the interpretation of omens, through dreams and divinely appointed kings. The direct interaction has become mediated. The Anunnaki are still the ultimate source of authority, but the authority flows downward through multiple levels of human hierarchy before it reaches the point where it can be acted upon. And by the time of the later periods, the Neo-Babylonian era, the Assyrian Empire, the periods of later transmission documented in the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, the Anunnaki have become almost entirely transcendent. They are present in the world. They are real. They hear prayers. They respond to offerings. They guide the fate of cities and kings. But they are not present in the world in the way they were present before the flood. They are present as divine beings operating from a distance, accessible only through ritual, interpreted only through signs, encountered only in dreams and in the highly controlled space of the temple and the priesthood. The question of why the ancient scribes returned to the flood narrative again and again, preserving it, copying it, refusing to allow it to be forgotten, begins to resolve itself when this pattern of increasing distance is understood. The flood narrative was not a story about something that happened in a remote mythological past and then was done with. It was a diagnosis of the ongoing condition of post-flood existence. It explained why the world worked the way it worked. It explained why the Anunnaki were not present in the way the oldest traditions claimed they had been. It explained why human beings had to work so hard, why civilization was so fragile, why every city risked destruction, why every generation had to re-establish the connection between the divine and the human through ritual and priesthood and extraordinary effort. And it explained something else, something that runs beneath the surface of the entire cuneiform tradition, but that emerges explicitly in certain texts. The post-flood world was not stable. It was not a permanent rearrangement that had reached equilibrium. It was a state of continuous decline, a world that was moving further and further away from the conditions of the pre-flood age, and that was no longer receiving the kind of active divine maintenance that had kept it in stable order when the Anunnaki were present and actively governing. The texts preserve evidence of this sense of ongoing decline in multiple forms. The king list itself, by its very structure, documents the decline. The reigns grow progressively shorter as historical time approaches the period when the list was compiled. The lament texts return again and again to the theme of divine withdrawal as the cause of destruction and decay. The era epic describes a world in which the divine assembly is becoming increasingly chaotic, increasingly fragmented, less unified in its governance. And the late texts from the library of Ashurbanipal, composed in the 7th century BCE, describe a world that has deteriorated so far from the pre-flood conditions that the very survival of civilization is in question at every moment. One of the most remarkable texts in the Ashurbanipal library is a composition sometimes called the Prayer of the Desperate Man, in which a worshipper describes his suffering and his illness, and his sense of abandonment by the divine world, and in which he reflects on the question of whether the gods still care about human beings at all. The text is not despairing in a nihilistic sense. The man still believes the gods exist and are real, but he is bewildered by the distance between human suffering and divine indifference. He offers prayers, he performs rituals, he maintains the proper conduct, and still the gods do not answer. Still the suffering continues. And he is left wondering whether the arrangement between the divine and the human has broken down so far that repair is any longer possible. This text comes from the 7th century BCE, more than 1,000 years after the Third Dynasty of Ur, more than 1,500 years after the period when the Great Flood narratives were first taking their developed form, and the question it asks, whether the arrangement between the divine and the human can be sustained at all in the post-flood world, is the question that the entire cuneiform tradition, taken as a whole, is asking. The answer the texts consistently give is barely. The arrangement can be maintained, but only through constant effort, through priesthood and ritual and the maintenance of sacred precincts, through the vigilance of kings and the devotion of scribes, through the endless copying of the narratives that explain why such effort is necessary in the first place. The catastrophe that caused the Anunnaki to abandon the earth was not, ultimately, a single moment of divine punishment. It was a remaking of the world itself, a change in the fundamental conditions of existence that made the kind of presence the Anunnaki had maintained before the flood no longer possible. The flood was the mechanism, but the consequence was an alteration in the nature of Earth itself, in the speed at which it operated, in the scale at which processes unfolded, in the relationship between the physical and the divine, that was irreversible. The Anunnaki did not leave because they chose to punish and then restore. They left because they could no longer stay. The world had changed in ways that were incompatible with their continued presence. The scribe in the Ecure of Nibiru is still there, in the darkness before dawn, pressing the reed stylus into the clay. He has been copying through the night. The oil in the lamp is low, the surface of the tablet is beginning to dry, which means he must work faster, must press harder, must be more certain of each mark before he makes it. He is approaching the end of the flood narrative. The boat has grounded on the mountains. Atrahasis has opened the vessel. The gods have gathered around the sacrifice. And now comes the passage that every scribe in the tradition knows he must preserve perfectly, because it is the passage that explains everything that comes after. The gods are hungry. They have not received offerings during the flood because there was no one to make them. The infrastructure of civilization, the cities, the temples, the organized flow of devotion and sacrifice from the human world to the divine had been completely disrupted. And in that disruption, something essential broke. Not just the cities, not just the human population, the reciprocal relationship between the divine and the human, the mechanism through which the Anunnaki sustain their presence in the world. When Atrahasis emerges and makes his offering, the texts say the gods gather around the sacrifice like flies. It is not a triumphant image. It is an image of hunger, of need, of beings who had been severed from the source of nourishment they required. The Anunnaki did not feed on the literal flesh and blood of sacrifices in the way that modern readers might imagine. The offering was symbolic, but the nourishment was real. It was the attention, the devotion, the constant flow of human energy and human organization directed upward toward the divine that sustained the Anunnaki in their presence in the world. When that flow stopped, when the flood destroyed the cities and killed the population and disrupted the temples, the Anunnaki were left without the medium through which they could maintain their presence. This is a different kind of catastrophe than the one described in the older mythological traditions, where the destruction of an enemy or the overcoming of a rival might be accomplished through direct conflict. The flood was not a conflict that could be won or lost. It was an event that disrupted the entire infrastructure of existence. The Anunnaki could not repair the cities. The Anunnaki could not resurrect the dead. The Anunnaki could not restore the pre-flood population quickly enough to re-establish the flow of offerings and devotion that had sustained them. They had to withdraw and wait for humanity to rebuild. And by the time humanity had rebuilt, by the time the post-flood cities were established and the temples were functioning again and the offerings were being made, the conditions had changed so fundamentally that the old arrangement could not be fully restored. The post-flood compromise, as the texts describe it, was the best that could be managed. Allow humanity to continue, but institute limits on population growth so that the noise and chaos that had provoked the flood would not return. Restore the ritual system, but make it clear that the divine presence would no longer be continuous or automatic. Establish kingship, but make it clear that kingship was a form of mediation, not a form of direct divine presence. The Anunnaki would still govern. The Anunnaki would still determine the fates, but they would do so from a distance through intermediaries, with the understanding that direct presence and direct governance were no longer possible. This understanding is embedded in the very language of the texts that describe the post-flood world. The pre-flood kings are described with epithets that emphasize their duration. Alulim reigned for 28,800 years. The post-flood kings are described with language that emphasizes their functions. When kingship descended from heaven again, it came to the city of Kish. The kingship, the function of mediation between the divine and the human, is what is important now, not the individual who holds it. The king is replaceable, the function is eternal. And this shift in emphasis from individual duration to functional continuity is itself a marker of the altered relationship between the divine and the human. In the pre-flood world, the duration of the king's reign mattered because the king was the representative of a being, an Anunnaki, whose presence was continuous and eternal. The king's lifespan was an expression of that eternal presence given temporal expression. But in the post-flood world, what matters is that the function continues, that the mediation is maintained, that the channels of communication remain open. Individual kings come and go, the kingship remains. The text that most directly articulates this post-flood political theology is the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic that was composed or at least received its canonical form during the reign of Hammurabi in the early 18th century BCE. The Enuma Elish is not primarily a flood text. It is a text about cosmological creation, the ordering of the universe from the chaos of the primordial waters, but it was composed in a world that was post-flood, in a civilization that understood itself to be living in the shadow of the catastrophe, and the text incorporates the flood narrative into a larger cosmological frame that explains why the post-flood world operates the way it does. In the Enuma Elish, the creation of the current universe is described as an act of violence and ordering performed by Marduk, the chief deity of the Babylonian pantheon. Marduk defeats the forces of chaos, represented by Tiamat, the primordial saltwater ocean, and creates the physical universe from her body. The stars are established in their positions, the calendar is fixed, the seasons are ordered, and then, at the end of the creative process, the assembly of the gods gathers to celebrate and to establish the governance of the newly created universe. And it is in that moment, in that assembly, that humanity is created, as the final act of creation, as the being whose purpose is to serve the divine order that has just been established. The significance of this positioning, humanity created last, as a servant of an already established cosmic order, cannot be overstated. Humanity does not exist before the cosmos is ordered. Humanity exists as a consequence of the cosmos being ordered. The human being is fitted into a cosmos that has already been completely determined by the gods. There is no room for human choice, for human deviation, for human resistance to the order that has been established. Humanity exists to maintain that order, to perform the service that keeps the cosmos functioning. But the Enuma Elish was composed in a world where that order, the order that had been established at the creation of the cosmos, that had been operative in the pre-flood world, that had been supposed to continue eternally, had been disrupted by the flood, and the text itself, by incorporating the flood narrative into the larger cosmological story, is implicitly asking, what happens to a cosmos when the order that was supposed to be eternal breaks down? What happens when the beings who are supposed to maintain that order are unable to maintain it? What happens to a creation that was made to serve that order when the order can no longer function as it was supposed to function? The answer, for the Babylonians who were copying and preserving the Enuma Elish in their own time, was, you manage, you preserve what you can, you maintain the ritual system, you establish priesthoods, you create bureaucracies, you work constantly to keep the fragmented remains of the original cosmic order from collapsing entirely, and you hope that the effort is sufficient, that the divine beings will continue to care about the world enough to send rain and prevent plague and keep the rivers within their banks and allow your city to survive another generation. It is a theology born of exhaustion and precariousness. It is not a theology that promises ultimate redemption or ultimate harmony. It is a theology that accepts the post-flood world as a diminished thing and asks only that it be held together long enough for civilization to persist. The grand aspirations of pre-flood humanity, to achieve immortality, to join the divine beings, to live in an age of unlimited time and unlimited resources, are understood in the post-flood world to be impossible. The texts preserve the memory of those aspirations. Gilgamesh's journey to find the plant of rejuvenation is a narrative about the impossibility of recovering what was lost. But the narrative is preserved not to encourage the attempt, but to counsel acceptance of loss. When Gilgamesh returns to Uruk with nothing he did not already have, when he is invited to look at the walls of his city and to find in that built achievement the only permanence that is available to a post-flood being, the text is offering a kind of wisdom. This is what you can have. Not immortality, not divine status, not the direct presence of the Anunnaki in your city, but the walls, the order, the civilization that you and your predecessors have built layer by layer, brick by brick across generations. That is what survives, that is what matters. That is, the catastrophe that caused the Anunnaki to abandon the Earth was, in the deepest sense, an event that reordered human consciousness and human possibility. Before the flood, according to the texts, humans could aspire to immortality, could be taken into the presence of the gods, could even, in exceptional cases like Enoch or Utnapishtim, be granted a lifespan that extended into the realms of divine time. The flood changed that. The post-flood world is a world in which human lifespan is brief, in which death is universal, in which the aspiration to divine status is understood not as a realistic goal, but as a kind of delusion that leads to suffering. But the post-flood world is also a world in which human beings are free in a sense that the pre-flood world did not permit. In the pre-flood world, humanity existed to serve the divine purposes of the Anunnaki. The human being was created to solve a management problem in the divine hierarchy. The human population was monitored and controlled. The human cities were administered according to divine decree. The human kings ruled at the pleasure of the Anunnaki, and their authority came entirely from the Anunnaki and could be revoked at any moment. In the post-flood world, humanity is still supposed to serve the divine purposes. The texts still insist on that. But the distance at which the Anunnaki now operate means that there is in practice more room for human agency and human choice than there was before. The divine will still determines the ultimate fate, but the means by which that fate unfolds can now be influenced by human action in ways that were not possible when the Anunnaki were directly present and directly managing. This is the paradox embedded in the texts that describe the permanent withdrawal of the Anunnaki. The catastrophe that drove them away diminished the human world in some ways, shortened lifespans, increased vulnerability, introduced suffering and death on a scale that had not existed before. But it also opened a space for human beings to become the primary agents of their own history, rather than secondary players in a divine drama. The post-flood world is more precarious than the pre-flood world. It is also more human. The scribes who copied the flood narratives generation after generation were not preserving a story of loss alone, though loss is certainly present in the texts. They were preserving a story about the nature of human existence, in a world where the direct presence of the divine has been withdrawn and where human beings have to maintain civilization through their own effort and their own devotion. It is a story that made sense to them because it explained their own experience. The cities they lived in were threatened with destruction. The priesthood they served was engaged in an endless effort to maintain contact with gods who were increasingly distant. The order they were supposed to maintain was perpetually fragile, perpetually threatened by chaos. But the order persisted. The cities were rebuilt when they were destroyed. The priesthood trained new generations to continue the work. The scribes copied the narratives that explained why that work was necessary. And civilization endured in the post-flood world, not because the gods had returned or because the pre-flood conditions had been restored, but because human beings continued to believe that the effort mattered, that the maintenance of the ritual system and the sacred precincts was worth the constant labor it required. That belief, that the preservation of civilization in the post-flood world was possible and worth the effort, was itself perhaps the most important legacy of the catastrophe. The Anunnaki abandoned the Earth, but they did not abandon it to chaos, they abandoned it to humanity. And the texts that record that abandonment also record, implicitly, the moment when humanity became responsible for its own survival and its own future.